Moments ago, President Cyril Ramaphosa emphasizing the need for the G20 to reform the institutions of global governance. The president says the forum must foster sustainable and inclusive economic growth and development in response to the needs and aspirations of African countries. Speaking there at the G20 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors Summit, which is currently underway in Cape Town. My colleague Arabile Gumede is there and joins us live. Arabile, good morning. When the president, we'll get to more of his sentiments, by the way, but when he left the podium, we saw him greeting a number of people instantly recognizable, people like Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank. Just share with our viewers who might not have been watching up until this point, who's in the room.
Yeah, a very interesting set of people, actually, that you make note of as well. Of course, ECB President, Madame Christine Lagarde, very significant as well to the entire perspective, representing, of course, the European Central Bank, but also the European Union at large when it comes to the central bank governors. And really the messaging from the European Central Bank sort of aligned somewhat with what you're getting then, particularly out of Reserve Bank Governor Leslie Tshakganyago with regards to fears around protectionism, globalization perhaps coming to an end somewhat, and how that might affect inflation and maybe remaining high when it comes to things like interest rates, and that might not go down as quickly as the world had perhaps wanted. So a very significant figure in that regard. Also important that you do have Kristalina Georgieva, of course, then, which is going to be quite important. Because from a global perspective, when one considers just how the IMF, the World Bank, and all the other multilateral finance institutions are at play here, we talk about reducing the debt of African countries. And that is one of the multilateral finance institutions that need to be looked at as how they can basically help. But here's an interesting one. Jerome Powell, of course, the chairperson or the chairman then of the central bank out of the United States, then the Federal Reserve chairperson, is actually here as well. So while we might be getting a sense of lower level, shall we call it, managers or perhaps leaders then out of the United States, the likes of Marco Rubio, of course, not being here, the international relations minister there, plus Scott Bessent, the finance treasury secretary as well, not being here. While they may not be here, the chair of the Federal Reserve out of the United States is. So that still tells you the significance of the G20 meetings then, particularly in trying to shape the economic foreground, as it were then, for the globe. So some significant figures still here and around, Iman.
Well, it's going to make for a very interesting day too as well, Arabile. Let's talk now about what the president had to say in the main. And I think one of the things that, are triggering conversations, not only in South Africa, but across the continent, is around, he talked about the amplification of the African voice, but we know the African Union is also a member of the G20, and I'm not sure if they're as vocal as one might expect, given the multiplicity of challenges facing the African continent as a whole. Talk to us about what the president had to say, but also about what we're hearing from the African Union delegation.
Yeah, look, Iman, you put forward some really interesting points, and there's so many of them that perhaps we can just get into. One, in terms of the diverging priorities, needs, and changes that Africa in itself needs, ultimately needing to come through with one voice. Let's remember that when the G20 began in 1999, ultimately it was aimed at serving the needs then of the global south, or rather the emerging economies. Over the years, however, it has seemingly shifted so much to worrying so much more about the West that perhaps this being the first G20 summit then being held on African soil, that the message by President Cyril Ramaphosa, by the African Union, is that Africa's voice needs to be heard a whole lot greater. In fact, it's something we saw out of 2023 when President Cyril Ramaphosa went all the way to France and was summoned among many other leaders and ultimately said to them, well, as world leaders, as the West, you summon us all the way here, and yet you do not do us any favors. When the world needed you most, for example, in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, you were nowhere to be found. So it's a similar message in that Africa needing to share its similar voice, but also standing as leadership amongst this G20 and showing that the global south actually matters quite significantly. On the whole, the message was also about collaboration and cooperation. Then Iman really saying that the only way to solve the situations that we currently face as the globe is going to be through multilateralism. But how do you continue to do that when, of course, you've got so many fractured parts within the G20, including, of course, the big elephant in the room being the United States. In fact, the president saying that multilateral cooperation is our only hope as the notion goes there. But he worries that, unfortunately, we do not move quickly enough to try and solve the world's problems as they currently stand. And that could be a way for us to, unfortunately, not protect the future as it stands right now, Iman.
Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana welcoming the president to the stage and basically bookending his address there. We also saw Lesetja Kganyago, the governor of the Reserve Bank. These are two central figures in South Africa's discourse at the moment, given the postponement of our budget and all of the machinations about whether they will reach consensus on the final budget to be delivered as promised on the 12th of March, Arabile. Anything we heard on the sidelines? Was there any chatter around South Africa's budget?
Well, no open mics. Yeah, no open mics is one thing we can promise you at present, Iman. That's certainly for sure. But one thing you kind of get is that because National Treasury then also remains in a closed-off period, you see that Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is actually removing himself from a whole host of panel discussions. In fact, the World Bank is set to host a discussion talking about decisive growth then and what that looks like for South Africa. And that report is set to come out on Friday. The initial invitation had included the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. He has now been removed. Only Barbara Creasy as well as World Bank delegates then are said to be there. So that's going to be very interesting to kind of get a sense of what actually happens from here. And let's remember that the 12th of March is not so long from now. And we're hearing machinations that indeed, even on Monday, the second proposed budget was actually declined then by members of the coalition for the GNU. And if that is the case, then even the 12th of March is actually looking pretty dicey as a date for when we'll even get that budget speech. So no, we haven't heard any murmurs, any rumors, and because he's avoiding sort of speaking a lot more, you can kind of tell as he began, he just said that he won't even be making a speech per se, but the conversations are going to get a little bit more difficult, and some answers are certainly going to be wanted then from the Finance Minister.
Arabile Gumede, thank you very much for that. The 12th of March it is until we officially hear otherwise. All eyes on the retooled South African 2025 budget. Arabile Gumede and Xolani Mbanjwe down in Cape Town for that meeting, the first meeting of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors.